Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Development Plan Panel. Just a quick reminder, we are now broadcasting on to the world, 7.3 billion potential viewers. So obviously keep your foul language to a minimum and behave yourselves. So my name is Councillor Neil Walsher. I'm chair of the Development Plan Panel. Got some introductory spiel, which Tash, our clerk, is going to start off with, and I've got my chair script, and then we'll do some housekeeping and go on with today's meeting, if that's okay. Tash?
Yep, great. Thank you, Chair. So I believe that all members are here and present that we're expecting. So we can just go straight over to you, Chair, to introduce everybody.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much for that. So go through my my script. This is a meeting of the Development Plan Panel, and it meets the requirements of the Council's constitution, even though members of the panel are in remote attendance, and everyone can see our faces via Zoom. Whilst item today will be fully discussed as usual, remote attendance requires a few slight changes about how I manage the debate. So therefore, can all attendees mute their microphones unless I invite them to speak? This will avoid disruption from background noise. Can all participants please keep their cameras on during the meeting? All participants will be invited to introduce themselves at the start of the public session in order to make it clear to public observers who are involved in the proceedings. Members wishing to ask questions, make comments, should do so by using the raised hand facility, which I think everyone's now familiar with on Zoom. I would also accept, if I don't see raised hand, just a wave of the hand is also quite helpful, just as a help the chair out, that'd be great. So, in order to avoid any disruption to the meeting, should I lose my internet connectivity, I propose we appoint a deputy chair who could step in during my absence, and I move that Councillor Kevin Ritchie be that deputy and invite another member to second that motion.
I'll second that, Chair.
Wonderful, thank you very much, folks. And I'll take a vote by assuming silence as approval. Any objections or abstentions or anything like that, please indicate. No, goodo. Right. So what I'll do now is I'll now invite members and officers to introduce themselves, and also could you mind to mute your microphone once you've introduced yourselves. So I'll start with Councillor Barry Anderson.
So Barry Anderson, Adlin Wharfdale Ward.
Thank you. Councillor Arif.
Morning, everybody. I'm Councillor Arif, Councillor Salma Arif, representing Gipton and Hare Hills.
Thank you very much. Councillor Campbell.
Good morning, everyone. Councillor Colin Campbell.
Councillor Andrew Carter is unfortunately unable to attend. He's next on my list. Councillor Collins.
Good morning, everyone. Councillor Dawn Collins from Horsforth Ward.
Thank you. Councillor Gruen.
Good morning, everybody. Councillor Caroline Gruen, Bramley and Stanningley Ward.
Councillor McKenna.
Good morning, all. Councillor McKenna from Army Ward.
Councillor Mulheron.
Good morning, everyone. Councillor Lisa Mulheron, Ardsley Robin Hood Ward.
And Councillor Ritchie.
And good morning from me, Councillor Kevin Ritchie, Bramley and Stanningley Ward.
Right. Thank you very much. Now let's go through our officers today. I've got Mr. Carr first on my list, but I don't think he's in attendance, is he? No. Okay. Mr. Elliott.
Morning, Chair. Martin Elliott, Head of Strategic Planning.
David Feeney, the Chief Planning Officer, is joining us in about half an hour. He's just in another meeting currently. Adam Harvard.
Morning, everyone. Adam Harvat, Group Manager for Policy and Plans.
Thanks very much. Lois Pickering.
Morning, Lois Pickering, Policy and Plans.
Nicole Walker.
Morning, Chair. Nicole Walker, Legal Advisor to the panel.
Could you remind people attending the meeting to mute their microphones to reduce background noise if at all possible? Just something to note for people watching, you may notice a number of officers on the call today, and they're here for technical support and will not be participating. So going through our traditional agenda, item number 1.
Right, so there are no appeals against the refusal of inspection of documents.
Wonderful.
And then agenda item 2, there are no items which require the exclusion of the press and public. Under agenda item 3, there are no formal late items of business. However, members should have received some supplementary information in relation to agenda item 7. Under agenda item 4, could I ask members to declare any disclosable pecuniary interests? I'll take silence as a no.
Good.
And then under agenda item 5, I've received apologies from Councillors Finnegan and Councillor Carter, and we have no substitutes today.
Okay, thanks very much for that, Tash. So, folks, if we turn to agenda item 6, which is our minutes of our last meeting. So, if we dare start on page 5 of the document pack. So, I was gonna, if members don't mind, I was gonna whiz through. If you're wondering why I'm looking over to my left, it's because my other screen is where I've got my papers is to my left. So I think probably the best way to do this is if I don't close my document down. That's better, right? Sorry about that. Go to the minutes, and what I should suggest is if any members have got any matters arising from the minutes is to indicate. Councillor Anderson.
Just briefly, I
Sure.
can't find a specific place on it, but I'm taking this comment under effectively work programme. I've been asked the emerging SCI. Where are we with the emerging SCI?
Oh, question. Martin, please.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Councillor Anderson. Yes, the as members will recall, the statement of community involvement (SCI) is a document which sets out how the council will carry out its public consultation activities in terms of plan making and decision taking. There's been one round of formal consultation with members of the public, and also a steering group set up involving local representatives to move that work forward. There has been some delay to progressing that to its next statutory round of consultation because of the COVID pandemic, but it is hoped that will be able to be swiftly progressed now, and we're taking stock of some of the announcements that came out of government around consulting and how local authorities consult, not only during the pandemic but moving forward. So it's still progressing, Councillor, and we hope that certainly at the next DPP we'll be able to provide a more thorough update on that.
Good, excellent. Okay, that okay, Councillor Anderson? Yeah. Okay, excellent. Any further comments on the minutes? Not seeing any indications. Good. In that case, can I have someone move them as a true record of the meeting? Members? Yep. Councillor Mulheron, thanks very much. Councillor Clegg, brilliant. Seeing nods and assent. Lovely, thanks very much. Lots of assent. Excellent. Okay. So that takes us on then to agenda item 7, which is quite a substantive piece of work, and it broadly fits into two sections. There's the update on the site allocations plan legal challenge, which Martin's going to lead off on in a moment. And then we've got the section of the report, which I really want to spend the bulk of the time on, really, because it is by far the most important. That's our local plan review and the policies that we want to bring into it. And obviously, members will remember that we've instigated a local plan review with climate emergency at its heart. That's our focus. Now, this is the meeting where we need to have a thorough, free-ranging policy discussion. Obviously, send officers away with lots of things to consider and answers to get. That's what I'd like to see this meeting shaping up. So, whilst I don't want to minimise debate on the first section, I think the second section is by far the most substantive and important one. As members will know that. Personally, as chair of DPP and chair of the Climate Emergency Advisory Committee, climate emergency is the most pressing matter we face over the long term. It threatens the future of civilization. I wish that was hyperbole, but it's not. So I want to spend the bulk of the meeting on that, if you don't mind. So given that, Martin, do you want to lead off on the SAP legal challenge update?
Thank you, Chair. And I believe that we have a presentation just to accompany this. I'll just wait for that to arrive on the screen.
Well, in our new stable Zoom Word, I'm sure it'll be fine. Excellent, it's appeared.
Here it is. It's there.
Wonderful.
So next slide, please. So this is to update members of the panel on what has been admittedly quite a lengthy process, far lengthier than I think anyone considered it would be at the beginning of the process. As members will know, the Site Allocations Plan, the SAP, was adopted in July last year after many years of preparation. The SAP setting out housing and other allocations in Leeds in accordance with the core strategy. Now, the Airborough Neighbourhood Development Forum submitted a legal challenge to the adoption of that document in August of 2019, and that legal challenge was eventually heard in the High Court in February 2020. The challenge from Airborough was on 7 grounds, and that's contained in para 2.6 of the report. And in summary, that related to considerations around the Council's strategic environmental assessment and also around reasons for Greenbelt release. And specifically, the Airborough Neighbourhood Development Forum were focused on 4 Greenbelt sites within their housing market characteristic area of Airborough, and that was the original focus of their claim, those 4 sites in Airborough. And their concern, their challenge was around the rationality of the removal of those sites from the Green Belt. Now, after the claim was heard at the High Court in February, there was quite a delay in terms of waiting for the judgment, and that judgment was eventually handed down in June 2020, late as a result of the pandemic, and that allowed the claim, which means that the judge supported 3 of the grounds, 3 of those 7 grounds. Now, the grounds that were supported related to the inspectors' report, the independent inspectors who were appointed by the Secretary of State to assess the site allocations plan, and the upheld grounds related to their reasoning within their report, and their reasoning firstly in terms of the exceptional circumstances for Greenbelt release, and secondly around the distribution of that Greenbelt release across Leeds, and thirdly around whether or not there was sufficient acknowledgement in the inspector's report of an increase in windfall sites, that is, sites that weren't known about when the site allocations plan was submitted to the inspectorate. Those new windfall sites being planning permissions mainly in the city centre and the inner area. Now, the judgment came in June, which allowed the claim, but there was then a further stage where all parties, the Neighbourhood Forum, the Council, the Secretary of State in terms of Planning Inspectorate, and also interested house builders could comment on what relief was what the judge should propose. Now relief is basically what the judge suggests should be done about the errors now that they have been found. Worth noting here that the Airborough Neighbourhood Development Forum, in their original facts and grounds, set out that the relief they originally sought was to put the 4 sites that were removed from the Greenbelt in the Airborough housing area back into the Greenbelt, but that position changed after the judgment was handed down, and the Neighbourhood Forum were seeking for that relief to be wider, to apply to all 38 Greenbelt sites that the site allocations plan had removed from the Greenbelt for housing purposes. After submitting thoughts on relief. The judgment is now awaited. Those relief submissions went in toward the end of June, toward the middle of June, and it was hoped and anticipated that we will have received the judge's findings on that by now. That is still awaited, and it is unlikely that we are going to be getting that now through the summer, because the High Court does actually close down during the summer. So unfortunately, there is likely to be a further delay on this decision. Can I have the next slide, please? Now, this is important because the council was committed to carrying out a review of the site allocations plan, and members will be aware that the review of the SAP was set out within the SAP itself through the introduction of a policy, HGR1, that recognised that the SAP was being adopted in advance of a new housing target being set within the core strategy selective review. And members will also recall that there was a pause within the site allocations plan process to allow for that by actually reducing the amount of greenbelt land that was required to be taken out, going from some 12,500 homes down to just over 4,000 homes. Now, that review still needs to be carried out to look at the level of allocations available within the site allocations plan for the longer plan period to 2033. Now, it had been intended that we would bring a scope of the site allocations plan review to development plan panel as soon as possible, but clearly whatever relief is determined from the Airborough challenge will affect what the scope of that SAP review looks like. So unfortunately, the immediate implication of the delay in the challenge and the laying down of relief is that that site allocations plan review is further delayed. And we won't know what that is until that relief is ordered and the implications of that are understood. So that's just to bring members up to date really with where we are, the nature of the judgment, and what the next steps have been and the implications on the SAP review.
Thanks, Martin. Good and comprehensive as always. Do we just bear with me a second while there we go. Get my full screen back so I can see you all. Has anyone got any questions or comments regarding Martin's update? Seen no indications. Oh, Councillor Campbell.
Right, sorry, I've clicked the box to put my hand up, but it didn't seem to be working.
No one's hand appeared. I don't know why that's not working.
Well, let's go back to the old fashioned.
That's why I mentioned it at the start.
Right. I suppose it's a bit unfortunate, isn't it, that the High Court's gone on holiday, because it does leave us in a slightly different position. Notwithstanding what anybody's personal views or panel members, the panel members' views were on those particular greenbelt sites. I suppose the question that causes me the most concern relates to what would happen given the position we're in at the moment, given the fact that there will be a delay before we get clarity from the judge. What would be the position if somebody turned up tomorrow with a planning application on either one of the greenbelt sites in Airborough or another one somewhere else in the city?
I think bring Martin on that. I mean, the short version is, apart from these sites, because there would be a legal question over them, if a site is not in the SAP, then there's no dice effectively. That's what having an SAP means. That puts you onto that footing. But Martin, do you want to come in at that point?
Thanks, Councillor. Thanks, Chair. Yes, if an application did come in on one of these sites, we would have to progress that. But in progressing that, we would clearly need to attach appropriate weight to the policies that were in view of the judgment.
Yeah.
Well, no, but the judgment's not arrived yet, has it? So, as I say, if somebody turned up tomorrow with a planning application for a greenbelt site, let's say in Horsforth, for example, because I know there are 2 or 3 in Horsforth. That's not part of the original request from the Airbury Neighbourhood Forum, but it's a greenbelt site. Now, currently, there is some question mark over the greenbelt sites. So what I think you're saying to me, Martin, is if we turn up with an application tomorrow, the council would have to accept the application and would have to progress it in a reasonable manner. And presumably, in an extreme case, if we didn't deal with it within 8 weeks, the applicant could appeal. But what would we say to an applicant in relation to saying, well, actually, we're in a difficult position about making a decision on this one because of this impending court judgment?
Martin, do you want to?
Thanks, Councillor. Thanks, Chair. So the judgment has arrived. The judgment is with us, but the relief isn't in terms of what that means for the specific sites. We would need to progress an application if it was submitted to us, because at the moment, notwithstanding the judgment, the plan remains adopted until the relief is set out. And there is, albeit a very, very small chance, that relief may be that nothing happens to the site allocations plan. But in terms of the process of looking at an application where it's submitted to us, and we have applications in the system now, we do have to continue to look at those. But we and the applicants are, of course, well aware of the situation as regards the judgment and what anticipated relief may be.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks for that, Martin. I've got a list of speakers. I don't want to remind colleagues that, whilst I know this is important, we don't have the relief yet. So we are sort of going over, I don't want to go over old ground. So Councillor Rich is next, then Councillor Anderson, then Councillor Collins. Kevin.
Thanks, Chair. Yeah, I just want to ask, there's the kind of, you've outlined a couple of the risks, Martin, to the council of the delay and, you know, the resulting relief that's announced. I just wondered what, if there's any kind of mitigation for the local authority, bear in mind that in 2.9, the judge has made clear the errors were of the independent inspectors. So not our errors, but we're going to have to pick up, you know, the consequences, as it were. So I just wondered if there were anything that could happen to mitigate that for us. Thank you.
Martin, do you want to come back on that key question?
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Councillor Ritchie. Yeah, I understand the frustration with that. Sadly, there isn't. The planning inspectors were appointed by the Secretary of State to look independently at the SAP. As you say, the judges found that the errors lie within their report and the reasoning that's been given within their report. But there is nothing to be done. There is no route to go back to the planning inspectorate to have that mitigated. And yes, the depending on what the relief is will depend on the risk and any potential next steps that are taken. But again, the planning inspectorate are insulated from any comeback on that.
Okay. Yeah, and it is worth considering that the council's decision making through the development of the SAP has not been called into question by this decision. It's the fault lies with the inspectors, which is enormously unfortunate. Does that satisfy you, Councillor Ritchie? Yeah, Okay, good. Councillor Anderson's indicated he doesn't want to speak. Councillor Collins.
Thank you, Chair. I appreciate we don't know what the outcome is going to be yet, but there is a high chance, a high probability that we're going to lose at least a couple of sites. So I just have some questions that I don't need a lengthy answer to, but if you can just bear with me. On page 12.2.3, officers say there was a downward housing trajectory. My question there is that a local trajectory, a national trajectory? And do we have an update? Is it still going down, or is it turning a corner? So that's bullet point 2.3. On page 13, 2.6, we refer to HMCAs. Now, these have always been a little bit of a bone of contention as to where did these come from, who set them, are they actually relevant? Is there going to be a review of whether we continue with the HMCAs or not? Or if we are going to continue with them, is somebody checking that they're still valid? On page 14, 2.17, it mentions the SHLA review. We obviously need that. And I just wondered at what point, or can we find out today, how is that going to be structured? So I think there's been concerns in the past that it's been very developer dominated. And when I first joined council and read through the list of sites that were being rejected, there were a lot that said potential contamination. And it did feel as if the developers just wanted those off the potential list. So what's happening with regarding the SHLA review? And those are probably the three at the moment that I'm interested in at this point.
Okay, Martin, do you want to come in on those? And at this point also welcome David Feeney, the Chief Planning Officer. Thanks for joining us, David.
Morning, everybody. Sorry to join late.
That's quite all right.
Meeting finishing up. Thank you.
It's a busy time. Martin.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. So, Councillor Collins, in terms of the downward trajectory, this was the phrase that was applied to the site allocations plan during its preparation to reflect that. The core strategy selective review was looking at a different housing target at the time, which was supported by a strategic housing market assessment, which effectively brought the core strategy down from 70,000 homes to 52,000 homes. So that's the reference to the downward trajectory, and that new number of 52,000 was set last year in the adopted core strategy selective review. So there'll be a chance to look again at that number in 5 years' time, as is required by government guidance. In terms of the review of the housing market areas, they again were looked at within the core strategy selective review, and they were used as well in terms of the strategic housing market assessment. Now, if members consider that a conversation about HMCAs is warranted through the local plan update, then we can certainly come to that later on in this session. And in terms of the SHLA, Councillor Collins, we've actually moved quite a way forward with the SHMA in terms of quite positive relationship with the Home Builders Federation. Back, I think, during the period you were referring to, there was quite a lot of disagreement in terms of house builder and council meetings. But now the approach of the SHLA is for house builders to provide up-to-date information on the sites that they are engaged with bringing forward. And as we know, we have a lot of different types of house builder in the city, not only those building in the outer areas, but also those building in the city centre in the inner area. And as those markets have become firmer and established, the evidence in terms of the deliverability of sites in that area has become a lot stronger and more defensible. So the SHLA is actually quite a positive way of looking at things. And in terms of the analysis of SHLA sites, that's carried out by the council itself. alongside house builders. So all the information that sits on a SLA site will be checked by the council using its evidence base. And that includes contaminated land.
Can I come back, Chair?
Yeah.
Right, thank you, Martin. That's reassuring in a lot of ways. I'm just a little bit concerned though regarding the downward trajectory and the HMCAs. That review was done before the judicial review. All I'm trying to do is to see if there's some piece of work we need to do now to protect ourselves in a way that the trajectory is still downward, that the reasons that we've maintained the HMCAs are still valid, just so that if we do get developers challenging us in the future because of the changes, we can stay, well, we've already done this piece of work. What we said then is still valid today.
Yeah, thanks, Councillor Collins. So just to be clear, the judgment doesn't raise any issues with the level of housing that was being looked at in the core strategy or the core strategy selective review, and doesn't cast doubt over the HMCAs as being an appropriate means by which to distribute housing. What the judgment focuses in some detail is an absence of thorough explanation by the inspectors about that. So the challenge shouldn't give rise to as a driver to a need to look at those issues, but they inevitably will be part of the local plan update moving forward, because they sit at the heart of the spatial strategy for Leeds. So we'll need to consider with and through members whether there are feelings for those policies to be updated or not.
Yeah, I agree. That's something we're going to have to come to a view to. Councillor McKenna, Jim, you're next.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you. Martin, I was just wondering, have these 4 sites been stymied forever? There's no possibility of revisiting them under the plan review. What does concern me is that if there is a shortfall in housing, and particularly if it's wider than these 4 sites in terms of greenbelt, and there was an extra 4,000 houses required, well, it could only be achieved by packing the inner city areas that a lot of us around the table represent. And I would find that most unpleasant and most disputable. We have, particularly in my area, we have very little green space whatsoever, never mind green belt. That's a pipe dream for us. But, you know, there's a lot of implications here. And I understand, Martin, that there's a lot we don't know and a lot has got to come out. I fully understand that. But it's something we will have to review. In line with what the chair says, we'll have to reconsider climate emergency changes and how it affects on policy. And certainly packing the inner city would seem to be an absolute no-no in that direction. A few questions there, and I know you can't give me any definitive answers, but those are my concerns. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks, Councillor McKenna. I mean, yeah, I represent an inner city ward myself as well, and it is a concern. I think especially the last 4 months have given everyone if it was needed, a refresher and a reappraisal about the importance of urban green spaces and how important to quality of life they are. So I am acutely aware of that. Martin, is there anything you want to add?
Can I come in, Chair, as well after Martin?
Of course you can, David.
Yeah, other than Chair, just to say that there is nothing to stop these sites coming back in as part of a future local plan or site allocations review. But clearly they would still remain, if they were to go back in the greenbelt, they would still remain greenbelt, so that the usual national policy tests would apply in terms of taking those out. But I understand Councillor McKenna's concerns. There was an awful lot of brownfield land included within the site allocations plan review, but members were keen that this wasn't just about providing housing in the city centre in the inner area. This was providing a spread so that everyone within Leeds' authority had the opportunity to purchase a new home.
Thanks, Martin. Yes, quite right too.
Chair, can I just have a word, please? And of course, I did mean to mention it, Martin, but we have the allocation of housing through the area's characteristic area, which means some areas are taking very little of the pain, you know, and that seems to me unfair, and that's not how we set out to do it in the first place. You know, there was a very carefully figured out that each characteristic area would take their fair share of housing, and it seems to me that when there's a shortfall like this, again, to repeat myself, the inner city areas is lumped, and I don't find that acceptable at all.
No, thanks, Councillor Kennedy. It's something we're going to have to be extremely mindful of going forward. Mr.
Yeah,
Feeney.
It was just following up on that point, really. I think Martin's covered it in part, but at the heart of the strategic housing market assessment, it was to look at sort of housing need across the district. And I think as Martin has sort of outlined, this is about meeting a range of needs spatially throughout Leeds and its communities, and being mindful that just providing in one area doesn't meet the needs in other areas necessarily. So I think the point that Councillor McKenna made about that sort of balance and the distribution is at the heart of what we've been trying to achieve. I think overlaying that in terms of the local plan review going forward, it's about thinking about that distribution through the climate change lens, so to speak. You know, how can we achieve and meet housing needs, but in a way that has much lower impact to enable us to achieve and meet our targets in terms of carbon reduction and the city being future-proofed in terms of the consequences of climate change and the climate emergency. Thank you, Chair.
No, thank you, David. There's a bit of white noise on you when you're talking, just as a heads up. I'm not quite sure why.
I think it's
Okay.
because the microphone's touching his cheek.
Oh,
okay. Thank you.
Move your microphone, David, slightly. Wonderful. They are very sensitive. No, thanks for that update, David. It's really important. Right. Can I ask colleagues, when you've spoken, can you put your hands down on the participations list? Because all 4 of you wanted to speak are still up. Thank you. Do your chair a solid now and again. That's great. Right. Look, can I move to the point where we've noted the review update. We are where we are with it. Obviously, we'll bring an update back to this panel as soon as we hear anything. As Martin said, that's going to be now in the autumn, as the court has risen. So, members, okay that we move on to the local plan review, which, and just to reiterate, you know, climate emergency is the most pressing issue we face. It is more pressing than COVID-19 in terms of what it would mean for the city as a whole. They're both pressing, but I think just climate emergency has that long-term threat to civilization. And I say that again for the second time, just to stress the import I put on it and the council puts on it. So on that now, Martin and Adam, who's leading off with this?
It's me, Chair, Adam Harvat.
Thank you. Go.
The presentation resumes, so if that could be just brought back up, please. Thank you very much. If we could go to the next slide, please. That's great, thank you. Right, okay, thank you. Yeah, the Leeds local plan sets the land use and spatial planning framework for how Leeds will develop. The current Leeds local plan is a set of 5 development plan documents, mainly covering the period between 2012 and 2028, but with some policies covering up to 2033. As well as reviewing the SAP, the council committed in its local development scheme to review and update other policies and plans. Members will recall that local authorities are required by the Town and Country Planning Act Regulations 2012 to review the policies that make up the local plan every 5 years. Since January, a review of extant local plan policies has been undertaken. This helps show how existing policies are performing, their conformity with national guidance, and whether an update needs to be considered. There are over 250 policies in the local plan. It is not proposed that they all need to be updated. Some, such as those updated by Core Strategy Selected Review, Site Allocations Plan, and the Aire Valley Leeds Area Action Plan, are very recently adopted and remain up to date. Appendix 1 in the agenda pack shows the results of that review. It concludes that there are policies, including some of the spatial policies of the core strategy and policies in the Natural Resources and Waste Plan, and saved UDP, where the evidence base needs refreshing or where local circumstances have changed to warrant consideration of an update. Within the context of national planning guidance, evidence and local priorities, it is crucial, therefore, that the local plan is kept up to date and subject to regular review to ensure it remains fit for purpose in providing certainty for communities and investors. Could we have the next slide, please? Thank you. The Council's local development scheme was agreed by panel in January 2020. It sets a three-year work programme for Leeds local plan, and noted that the scope of the Leeds local plan update would be determined through A, the review of local plan policies to see if they needed updating, and B, in response to council priorities, in particular the climate emergency. It is noted that full council on the 11th of September 2019 approved a commitment that a future plan review should include a strategic plan to 1, plant more trees, 2, place a greater emphasis on sustainable and active travel to new developments, and 3, review policy SP12 related to Leeds Bradford Airport. I think it's important just to kind of touch on terminology here, or how officers are using the terminology, just so that we're clear. The local plan review and the local plan update, they're essentially opposite sides of the same coin. The local plan review is the process that we go through to assess how up to date our existing policies are. The local plan update is the mechanism by which we update the local plan, including all the strands related to the climate emergency. Could we have the next slide, please? The need to update policies to help Leeds meet its declared climate emergency is paramount because of the commitment of the council is to be net carbon zero by 2030. This is to ensure that the amount of carbon emissions that Leeds emits between now and 2050 stays within the 1.5 degrees temperature rise recommended by the United Nations. Therefore, one approach would be to focus on those policies within the local plan which can contribute towards reducing carbon emissions. However, policies to mitigate and adapt to the impacts of climate change and policies to promote sustainable development are very much interrelated. The shape of strategic and non-strategic policies on the climate emergency can be summarised as follows. The spatial strategy. The local plan update provides an opportunity to strengthen policies on the location of development, densities of development in the most sustainable places, maximisation of brownfield land, avoiding flood risk and accessibility of development close to public transport hubs, and/or active travel routes. Carbon reduction and sustainable design and construction. The local plan update can consider policies for net zero carbon buildings in Leeds, and the council now needs to develop an evidence base that shows how this can be justified and achieved. Renewable and low carbon energy generation and district heating. The local plan update can explore the role of local low carbon and renewable energy potential within Leeds. There is an opportunity to identify suitable sites for renewable and low carbon energy sources, such as solar, wind and geothermal, heat distribution, and for energy storage. Green and blue infrastructure, including tree cover, green space and biodiversity. There are opportunities to set targets and make land available for new tree planting and other measures to improve tree cover. Natural flood risk management options are preferred, and there are opportunities to reinforce and strengthen policies on the use of sustainable drainage systems, which are known as SUDs. Sustainable travel, car-free living and walkable neighbourhoods. There needs to be close alignment between development and transport planning so that options for car-free living and walkable neighbourhoods can be realistically considered. Next slide, please. Following the initial scoping work that was undertaken on the local plan update, the world has been hit by the COVID-19 pandemic, which has had a profound impact on all aspects of life within the country. Of particular importance to the local plan update is the impact the pandemic has had on employment, both in terms of employment levels, but also more broadly its impact on employment patterns such as commuting and office floor space demand. Obviously, it's impacted the retail sector and the resilience of our high streets profoundly, but also, as Chair noted, the people's access to green space has been a particularly huge issue over the last 4 months. This has resulted in a reassessment of the need for future policies in light of COVID-19, and that work is still ongoing. In addition, further policies are being explored, including infrastructure and investment with a particular focus on HS2, the city station and mass transit, and placemaking, which could set out the strategic role that placemaking plays in different communities in terms of ensuring resilient and stronger communities alongside meeting council priorities whilst maintaining and enhancing local character and distinctiveness. Next slide, please. Thank you. This plan-making process is happening in the context of major changes to the planning system, as signalled by the government. Changes to permitted development rights, and which will particularly impact on the delivery of housing and town centre uses, and very recent changes which predate the writing of this report, but to the use class order, which will impact on town centre uses particularly. The local plan update will have to take account of all of these changes as and when they are finalised and understand its implications. Next slide, please. The first regulatory milestone in this timetable is the initial stage of public consultation, known as Regulation 18 consultation, which was initially scheduled for autumn-winter 2020, but has been delayed as a result of the SAP legal challenge and COVID-19. It is now indicatively scheduled to start in spring 2021. The purpose of this stage is to get views on what matters the local plan update will need to consider and address. In other words, its scope. The relevant regulations specify that as part of the plan preparation process, we should invite representations on what the local plan ought to contain. Whilst being mindful of the need to not prejudge the outcome of that consultation, it is considered that it would be helpful and speed up the process if the Council's preferred scope of policies were used as a means of generating responses to the plan at that early stage. This would hopefully help shorten the timescale for preparation and focus comments. So therefore, agreeing the preferred scope of the document is the next key phase of the timetable, and considering the pros and cons of extending the scope beyond the climate emergency is obviously of key importance. A series of topic-based papers are being prepared, and it is proposed that these be brought to panel members for members' consideration to help guide that preferred scope over the coming months. And that is the end of the presentation.
Great, thank you very much. So, thanks for that, Adam. So, effectively, that the next stage of our discussion, colleagues, is what do we think should be in scope, and if there's anything of particular detail importance, I think that this is an opportune time to discuss it. I think our starter for 10 really is, despite the limitations of national planning policy, and that's in a state of flux at the moment, which is a concern, and I think that'll be a subject of an update at our next panel meeting. The government might have thrashed out some of its plans. There's going to be some action in Parliament regarding planning this coming week, well, this week rather. So I guess the start for 10 is how do we get new build housing and apartment type housing in Leeds to zero carbon, or as near to zero carbon as feasible, within the scope of this local plan review? I think that's probably a big central question for us to be able to answer and to be able to have those policies in place. And my second sort of broad scope area is, particularly the last 4 months have shown us somewhat of a different world, despite the most tragic of reasons for it and awful of reasons for it. But there's been a lot of talk about localities again, and about how people can exist in their local communities far more ably. And that's led to discussions of things like 15-minute neighborhoods, i.e., can I, from my home, reasonably do the things I need to do within a 15-minute walk, or cycle, or some form of active travel? I think that's something we should also consider. So given those points, I'll open it for other members, Adam, Martin, and David, and then we can probably come back with some discussion on that. So, David, Councillor Mulherrin, do you want to kick off on this, and then I'll bring in Mr. Feeney, and then I've got Dawn, Barry, and Colin.
Thank you, Chair. You've already raised the point I particularly wanted to make. I just think it's really, really important, and we're looking at active travel neighbourhoods for existing housing at the moment, and looking to roll them out as trials in some of our communities. But actually, if you look around the world, kind of other kind of leading cities are doing that, and looking to the future as well. So if you look at Paris or Copenhagen, Utrecht, yeah, you've got examples in near European neighbours where this is being done very successfully. And the idea being that within maybe 20-minute walk, cycle, or public transport journey, you can get all the basic daily essentials that you need from where you live. And given the experience of COVID, where people have under lockdown had to stay local, worked from home, with the exception obviously of key workers. I think there is a growing interest in being able to facilitate that. So with local amenities being accessible within that short journey time from home to support that kind of community regeneration. And I think there's really great potential for this, including, you know, reducing carbon emissions, improving air quality, and improving physical health and well-being, because people then choose to walk, cycle, scoot to their local amenities rather than driving to something further away to get the things that they need for the day-to-day lives. So I'm really, really keen for us to look at that as an area under this new local plan.
Yeah, no, I agree entirely, absolutely. As a really good and strong opportunity to hit all those notes, isn't there? David, do you want to come in now?
Thank you, Chair. I think Councillor Mulheron sort of picked up on some of the themes I was going to raise. Just a few observations, if I may. I think the first thing is the impending planning reforms. I think we do need to be mindful of the implications of those. I mean, there's meant to be a planning policy paper, as it's been described, issued this week, and we need to understand what that is, what's been proposed, what the consultation is, and then how that's going to lead to change in terms of NPPF or national planning legislation. So that's all still to be understood. But I think within the context of that, we just need to make sure that the priorities that Adam has outlined in terms of the scope of the local plan review don't get lost. And I think one of the issues for us is that our sort of longer term strategy isn't overwhelmed by shorter term measures and initiatives coming out of government which might compromise that sort of longer term structural change that I think we need to be working toward in terms of dealing with climate emergency and future proofing the city, because, you know, rightly so, there's been a number of adjustments to aspects of planning to support economic recovery or community resilience in terms of flexibilities, which have been important, but there's a longer term set of issues here which we need to be sort of embedding and applying in terms of our policy and our strategy going forward. So that was sort of a general point on the planning reforms. I think in terms of the important point, Councillor Walshaw, you've made about the issues associated with the performance standards of new properties. I mean, that's clearly very, very important, especially meeting our housing requirements. In parallel with that, though, I think we also need to be pressing to enable easier and effective retrofit of the existing housing and commercial stock as well, because given that most of, you know, Leeds is already here, so to speak, there's a challenge there in terms of retrofitting the existing fabric of the city to make sure that makes a positive contribution as well. So I would hope that the government reforms would help to enable planning to have a positive impact on that in some way. So I think that's important to thread into all of this as well. And then finally, you know, very valid points that have been made by Councillor Mulheron about the importance of living locally and some of the initiatives which are current and effective elsewhere in other cities. I think one of the opportunities for us here is to sort of try and join up some of these things, because at the moment there are issues around the vitality and viability of town and local centres, which was a circumstance that was sort of in play before the pandemic came along in a way. But I think there's been a recognition through what you've been saying, Councillor Walshaw, about local infrastructure within a 15-minute travelling time through active travel locally. And I wonder if through the plan there's an opportunity for us to reimagine the role of town and local centres as almost local supply chain hubs. You know, there's a way of reimagining their role in terms of how do they fit within that sort of service infrastructure, but at a local level. So if people are increasingly reliant and necessarily so on local travel to get the things they need, then there's a resource opportunity there if local centres are within reasonable distance of where people are living, and can they be repurposed in a way that enables them to meet these broader needs. So just a few thoughts there, if that's helpful. Thank you.
No, really, really helpful. I agree entirely. So I've Councillor Collins is next.
Thank you, Chair. I think for me, personally, one of the highest priorities is people's access to green space, especially in the inner city and the surrounding areas where it is very urban. And I just wonder if there's more we need to do in our policies to make sure that developers do actually provide more green space on site. There are some good developers who see that putting the green space in will actually help them sell their properties or let out their properties and therefore do it. But we're seeming to be very much dependent on the developer's choice at the moment. And I'm just wondering what we can do to strengthen our point that they have to put more green space in. It's great, the idea of you can go somewhere like a park within 15 minutes or 20 minutes, but I don't know about other people, but I like going out my back door and sitting in my back garden when I've just got a sandwich and I might only be there for 10 minutes. But it makes you feel an awful lot better if you can actually do that. So having more things on site, even if it's a few trees and a bench, I'm just wondering what we can do within our policies to bring those sort of things forward.
No, it's a good point. I think if members cast their mind back to when we started this process before the current pandemic unpleasantness started, one of the things I did raise as a suggestion is effectively making hedgerows mandatory rather than fencing, because that would make what should, I would hope, be a relatively simple policy adjustment. Obviously, sometimes famous last words, of course, but at a stroke, you would gain a lot more green infrastructure. What a dreadful consultant's phrase, green infrastructure. But hedgerows, more biodiversity, more carbon capture, more local oxygen, just better for everybody. And I think I agree. I think so. Officers have a mind to Adam and Martin to strengthen green space requirements. Before we get officers to come in, I want to get Barry and Colin have indicated they want to speak. So let's go with Councillor Anderson, and then Councillor Campbell, and Councillor Ritchie, and then I'll bring officers in for a session. Thanks.
I would like to make just a general comment to begin with, and then go into specifics.
Sure.
In terms of general comments, in the light of what was said about the delay because of the Edinburgh judgment, it would be good if we could get some interim timetable out as to what we can do prior to that one coming out. In other words, what can we get done that isn't necessarily dependent on that particular judgment, because there are things to do with the high streets, for example, and in terms of climate change that we could probably get on with just now. So if we could get an indicative timetable, not today, sometime over the next few weeks. But also the other thing I'd like to see is a better definition within the council of what is meant by environmental sustainability and social sustainability. At the moment, I think we've all got an excellent understanding of economic sustainability in terms of the 3 tests within the NPPF, but I would argue that we've probably got Heinz's 57 varieties on the other 2 as to what they actually mean. Now, it's not defined within the NPPF, and so it is a lawyer's charter, the way that it's set out. But recently, and at 1 or 2 plans panels, there has been complications because of not really understanding what the council's view is on those 2 particular items and what individual plans panel members' interpretation of those items are, never mind the public not necessarily understanding. So that's the generality. In terms of the specifics, surely we could get on with some work on the natural resources and waste plan, because I don't think that's affected directly by the Edinburgh situation. And that one was 2013, so that's some time. The world has changed a lot in that time in terms of distances we might have thought was acceptable to bring in materials in the past. Now, this can have a detrimental effect on some of our areas. I accept what I'm saying could have a detrimental effect, but if we're trying to reduce the distances to bring in materials and various other things, then we need to have a look and a view on it so that at least we can have an honest discussion with the public in terms of the implications of it. In terms of paragraph 2.29, I do think we need to get a paper as quickly as possible on what the PD rights and the effect that they're going to have in the city centre. I heard what Councillor McKenna said earlier on about potentially more housing going into the city centre. Well, one of the unintended consequences, or intended consequences, depending on how kind you want to be to the government, is that we might find a number of office blocks coming forward for conversion over to housing. So what's going to be the implications of that, and also the lack of appropriate green space around those particular city centre locations? How are we going to square that circle? Because I do think that there is a contradiction in that particular one there. And there's also the contradiction between having a thriving city centre and high streets, as Grant Shapps has found out for himself, that his policy, he's now arguing against his policy officially because he's now been told by his high streets that he's now cutting off the sustainability of them because you can't get any place to park, you can't park outside shops and various other things like that. So we've got, these are decisions and discussions that we've got to have in terms of the contradictions that are in place. Then if I move on to paragraph 316 in terms of cross-boundary matters, one of the issues that if Andrew Carter had been here today, I know he would have brought up, is Bradford's proposals for building this link road. He listened into, I think it was a scrutiny meeting that was taking place in Bradford recently, where it was firmly still on the agenda. So in terms of cross-border matters, I'm only picking that up as an example. There are a number of other I'm just showing that one, that I think we need to look at the implications so that we can reflect our policies accordingly. The next one, I'd be interested to know what officers' views are on paragraph 318, which is about at regional level the impacts of the West Yorkshire devolution deal, because I asked a question at scrutiny on this and was given an assurance that there would be little or no effect. Now, I don't agree with that answer I got, and I know from speaking to some officers, they are equally concerned about this. So what was actually said, and can we get it made public, what was said in our council's response back in this particular area? And on that, we maybe need to look at what things need to be devolved down to a more local level, to community committee level, for example, in terms of powers and suggestions and working through some of those examples. Because I think we would all agree that the best way of sorting any pandemic out in the future is to take it down to the lowest possible level. And the example I gave at council was the volunteers. So maybe we need to look at some of our policies. Instead of having a one-size-fits-all policy, having an overall strategic policy, but allowing local variations depending on the circumstances that suit things locally. I've covered the town centres. It'd be interesting to know what is meant by, in paragraph 319, managing the growth of Leeds Airport, because that's obviously very controversial just now, and trying to explain to some people what is happening with planning applications and what the greater expansion is going to be is proving very difficult. So I do think we need some clarity on that. We need, as a development plans panel. Green infrastructure, yes, I do think we need to do a heck of a lot more on that. Climate change, well, Councillor Gruen might not thank me for saying this, but recently I was arguing against a case, and Plans Panel, well, while not necessarily agreeing with me, were sympathetic to the points I was making on climate change, but because we didn't have the policies in place, they were hamstrung as to what they could and couldn't do in order to try and take forward some of the arguments that I was making. So I do think it's important, because sometimes members appear to have a greater understanding as to what we're trying to do as a council than necessarily some of the planning officers do, and we need to try and resolve that one way or the other. We need to get clarity so that we're both talking about the same things. And then if I just go through to the end where we've got Appendix 1. Do we need to do a review of SP6 and SP7 because they are missed off of Appendix 1? Do we need to do one as a development plans panel? Should we do one? I would suggest maybe we do need. In terms of policy H1, managed release of sites, it says that it's not considered. It's considered to be up to date in conformity with the NPPF, but we might have to look again at how we're going to do it, particularly in respect of what the chair said about the 15-minute distances, because some places are detached, either semi-detached or fully detached from the rest of Leeds. And the same with potentially policy H2 as well. Policy H4, again, I fell foul of that the other day at Plans Panel when I was trying to argue what was meant and what it actually says. Nobody doubted that what the essence of what I was saying was probably correct, but we didn't actually have the policy wording to back it up. So do we need a rewording of the housing mix as to what we really mean as opposed to what we think we mean? And then policy G3, standards for open space, sport and recreation. Again, taking into consideration what's said about city centres and about the 15-minute thing, I do think we need to look at that. Again, officer recommendation is no, and it's considered to be up to date. I would suggest not. So I know that's a lot, but it is something that I take very, very seriously, what we're trying to do here. And this is the opportunity that we've got to try and bring clarity. We'll have differences of opinion, I accept that. But let's have the debate and let's see if we can come up with a central plank of policies that we can agree on. Thank you.
No, thanks. I know there's a lot, Barry, but that's fine. This is the forum for that. Probably what would be a good idea now is, because between myself, Councillor Mulherin, Councillor Collins, Councillor Anderson, there's been quite a lot of member questions and quite a lot of points raised. What I've proposed to do is bring in officers now, and then post that we've got Councillors Campbell, Ritchie, Arif and Gruen to come in. I think that's probably the best way of dividing this up. So on that, officers, who wants to come back, starting from the top with the issues I raised?
Yeah, shall I come back on that, Chair, Adam?
Yeah, please.
If obviously if other officers notice I haven't picked up in full a comment, please step in. I will be looking to my left just to look at the notes that I've made, so please bear with me. But in terms of the points you made, Chair, in terms of how do we go about a policy approach to make our development zero carbon, essentially. We're already pursuing that angle in terms of the energy performance through the SEAC working groups. We're engaging with the Green Building Council, and we're trying to capture good practice elsewhere. There's lots of good practice out there at the moment, including London, but other authorities too. We are lobbying government in terms of trying to get them to be more ambitious about building regulations, because that's obviously a major part of the energy efficiency standards of buildings as well. Whilst obviously that dovetails with the planning system, it's not necessarily directly affected by policy. What a major strand of it as well is viability. I think it was Councillor Anderson who spoke about the three strands of sustainability, and that has to be a major plank of any evidence that we produce, that any efficiency standards that we set do have to be demonstrably viable, and that's work that we know that we need to do. Once a kind of a preferred scope of what these policies might be, we can start to test the viability of that. But that's our approach. The easiest part, in a sense, is writing the policies in some respects, because we can set out standards fairly easily, but to understand whether these are achievable is the real crux of it, and so that's where the real effort needs to go. Okay. Councillor Mulheron's points about active travel, yeah, I completely agree with that. I'd also read up on those kind of 15-minute neighbourhoods, and I think that's a way of, as David said, it's probably a way of helping our local town centres in a way that anecdotally we've heard that they have benefited from in some respects, probably quite narrowly. I accept that from the lockdown in some respects. That people have been forced to shop locally. Some local centres may have benefited from that. Some communities, however, may have really suffered and struggled as a result of that because they don't have those facilities. And so I think reappraising how we look at our communities is something that we can certainly focus on here. Traditionally, it's probably not. We probably look at a higher level, and I think this is an opportunity to perhaps look down on a kind of medium grain. Which I think is really important, because it's not just about access to retail. It's obviously access to green space and other infrastructure as well, which will be really important. So yes, I think that's something that we can certainly look at. Just going through the other comments, Councillor Collins. Yeah, there is an issue in terms of delivery of green space on site. One of the tasks of the core strategy selective review was to update the policy on green space delivery, and that re-emphasised the importance of delivering on site. Now, clearly that's a fairly recent policy, so it's going to take time for that to bed in terms of development management decisions and building on the ground, but we certainly hope that will see improvements of delivery of green space on site. However, I think an avenue that on that point, obviously we need to keep that under review. We need to monitor that to make sure that is actually happening, which is something that we're currently doing anyway through green space monitoring work. So that's something to certainly keep in mind. In terms of the city centre aspect though, our policies as it stands doesn't require any green space where developments are less than 0.5 of a hectare. And I think that's something that we probably really need to look at again in terms of, because there's particular pressures, aren't there, in the city centre area for people. Whilst the city, the authority as a whole has obviously put a huge amount of investment into new sort of pocket parks. The one outside Merion's a really good example of that, and there are others. There's obviously the city park, which is a lot of work is underway to deliver that, and that will obviously see a real improvements. But I think if we can lever in more investment through developments, that's going to be really positive as well. But we need to make sure this is usable green space, and that's a really key thing. So I think looking at that threshold, certainly from an officer point of view, I think that's something that we're keen to consider, if members are likewise. Just going through, Councillor Walshaw, again, you made the point about hedgerows rather than fencing. I think, yeah, absolutely, we can consider the viability of that as an approach, and in effect, that's design guidance, isn't it? I think it's about placemaking, really, about how we make places more attractive, more resilient, and be more creative in the way that we can deliver some of these solutions. Councillor Anderson, in terms of internal timetable, absolutely, yeah. We can make sure that we can progress that and make sure that's available. I don't know whether you wanted it for the next meeting or in advance of the next meeting, but certainly there are lots of things that we're doing right now in terms of updating topic papers that haven't been delayed necessarily by COVID-19. What they have been is forced to reconsider, in a sense, particularly on issues like green space or town centres. So that's forced us to reconsider our thinking. In many respects, it won't necessarily change it, as Martin said, I think earlier, perhaps it was David. The pressures on our town centres haven't necessarily been caused by COVID-19, but they certainly have been exacerbated by them. They were already struggling, and that has gone into sort of a free fall in some respects as a result of COVID-19, and we can see that in footfall figures in the city centre. But yeah, we can certainly develop a timetable for how we'll progress on this work. I mean, the first point, as I said in my presentation, was to prepare essentially topic by topic papers for consideration of panel members at DPP to show options in terms of policy formation. And if that's supported, that's obviously something we can timetable through for the next few months, if that's helpful.
I think it is, yes.
Yeah.
How many more points you got to cover?
Just going through Councillor Anderson's,
Sure.
there were a few there, so I'll try and do it briefly. A better definition of what is meant by environmental and social. I think this is a tricky issue for us to grasp with. Clearly, national policy, as you suggested, doesn't necessarily provide a huge amount of detail. I think what we have to do is make sure that it's sustainable against, core strategy objectives, against best council plan and priorities, and use that as the basis for what we're seeking to achieve, and make that perhaps vagueness on a national level work for us on a local level, where we can put our own stamp on what we mean for Leeds for these things. PD rights, yeah, there's a huge amount of change. It's something that David touched on. There's a huge amount of change happening to our high streets. I think one of those first topic papers that would perhaps benefit from coming is a look at high streets, because I think that can consider the impacts of PD rights and the impacts of changes to the use class order, which were announced last week, and are going to have quite a profound impact on what uses can change to others without the requirement of planning permission.
Yeah.
So I think that's something we could bring as an earlier rather than later topic paper.
Yeah.
Cross-boundary working, yes, we recognise the importance of that. The systems we already have set up in terms of the duty to cooperate, I would hope are robust enough to deal with that challenge. They have worked in the past. That approach has been found sound to be in the past with previous plans. So we're confident that that will be the case moving forward. In terms of the regional spatial strategy, I'm not development strategy rather. I'm probably not close enough to on those issues to talk about, so it might benefit for perhaps Martin or David if they wanted to come in on those elements. But I think that was everything. Apologies if I've missed anything there.
No, it's very comprehensive. I don't think you did. David, Martin, is there anything further to add?
Chair, I was going to come in, Chair, but I'm just conscious
sure.
there are a few members wishing to speak, so I'm happy to pick up any issues. I did have a few additional comments that Councillor Anderson had raised to come back on, and the point about green space, but Martin might want to come in, and I'm mindful that other members are wanting to speak as well. So I'm happy just to come back later if that would be helpful.
Well, I've got 4 more members to speak, so if we bring those in, and then officers can come back to the points they raise. So on that, it's Councillor Campbell, Ritchie, Arif, and Gruen. So Councillor Campbell.
Thank you, Chair. I suppose I'm in a slightly difficult position in relation to the current policy of government, which seems to be to make decisions by photo opportunity. So we've got a slight, I suppose there must be a conflict going on within government about the planning system, because some elements seem to be saying, well, effectively tear up all the regulations and get on with it. And other sections appear to be suggesting things that would require more legislation and more constraints. So I'm not sure that's played out yet. That said, I found myself in a slightly difficult position, and it was a good job I was sitting down, that I actually agree with everything you said at the very beginning.
It might happen again, you never know.
Well, yeah, well, we'll live it out. But I think certainly within the City Council, we all have a general clear view about the direction we want to travel. And particularly I'm interested in sustainable housing, sustainable because, through build quality, but sustainability from site. So the idea of a 15-minute neighbourhood sounds pretty good to me. The green space one has been a long-standing argument of mine, because we have, well, even up to the present day, been allowing developers to buy out of their green belt commitment to, their green space commitment within housing developments. It's always been this view, well, you can provide it off-site, i.e. you can give Parks and Countryside some money and they'll tart up a park. I think the point that was made earlier on by somebody, which is one of the things that we've noticed over the lockdown period is how much pressure has been put on green spaces and parks in particular in my part of the world. So I think actually the demand is there for that space for people to just get that bit of freedom, a bit of notionally fresh air, a bit of relief, because I think people have worked out that green space actually provides you with some mental well-being. And there's this talk about that, in effect, we don't ask for any in the city centre. And I've always said we should do. And I think see no reason why groups of developers shouldn't get together and put in a combined green space in relation to several developments. Can I just take an issue with, and I can't remember which officer said it, but they referred to the term demonstrably viable. Now, my experience of developers is that their view is nothing's viable.
Yes.
So actually, rather than use the phrase demonstrably viable, I wish we would use the phrase demonstrably unviable, because I think that puts more of an onus on developers to show that actually the only thing that's making this unviable is that the level of profit. Thank you, Chair.
Yeah, thanks, Councillor Campbell. We have good developers who are keen to meet policy requirements, and we have other developers that try their damnedest not to meet any of the policy requirements. That's a constant struggle for us, with officers and plans panel members. I think everyone would have real concerns about the current changes of the planning system. There is, like I said, there is real tensions in the government between the sort of laissez-faire creative destruction types and those who are perhaps thinking a bit more in a more structured sense. Planning decisions last lifetimes. I would suggest the planning system is not the problem here. The planning system the problem rather is landowners and developers when it comes to meeting both our housing needs and getting the right kind of housing in the right places. It's not the planning system. And that's a real concern, because I think the government's expansion of permitted development rights, whether it's extensions upwards from houses or particularly really concerned is an ease of moving from office buildings to residential space, is really opening up the doors to the slums of the future. And I think we're already seeing that in certain areas, particularly in London. There have been some frankly appalling developments that have no place in the 20th century, let alone the 21st. So that is a huge concern, and officers are going to have to be sharp as to updating members on all these changes, and we will be lobbying hard as a council against the ones we feel are unfair. I think I'm going to bring in the next few members to speak, and then we'll get officers to bring those points all together. So it's Councillor Ritchie next.
Thanks, Chair. Yeah, just to endorse the crucial matter of climate change, I'd just like to make one point that it's so important that we reduce that threshold before the requirements of the N1 and what have you come into play to one property. I just also then want to pick up on affordable housing. Members are always keen to have more affordable housing. Government make noises about it, but it's hard to keep up with what they actually mean on it, to be honest with you, my view anyway. H5, which I think is affordable housing, isn't mentioned at all in the plan, really. There is a reference to in the Appendix 1 to H14 about rural affordable housing, and that'll be under review in 5 years, but nothing on H5. So I'd just like to clarify if I may have missed it, and apologies if I have, but I think that should be under review, because that is a massive priority for members of this council, I think on all sides, to be fair. So if you could clarify that, and that's me done. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Kevin. Sal, do you want to come in?
Yes, Chair, thank you. I guess what I want to, and this has been alluded by other members, is I want to talk about planting trees. Obviously, tree planting enhances an area, but it also absorbs pollution as well. And I think what I'm keen to see is developers actually working with community groups in the area. So your Bloom group, even schools, so children get to have a say in terms of what sort of tree planting is available, just so the community can take ownership and take care and look after it. And I think that those conversations really need to happen. And I'm just really would hope that this conversation can be taken further, and we encourage developers to have conversations, Chair. Yeah,
and I agree completely. I mean, if people have a sense of buying and ownership, then they're more accepting of, say, more residential development in their area, and if the benefits are real and manifest and address things like climate change, I totally agree. Councillor Gruen.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, my point is a bit more processy. I'm just interested in the process of how these are going to be reviewed and rebuilt, because lots of people today have said lots of important things about the policies that we are most passionate about. Green infrastructure, landscape, EN1 and EN3 reducing carbon, tree cover, biodiversity, there's waste management in there, etc. Each one of them is quite a significant piece of work to move in the direction that we want to and to get to the place we need to be. And I suggest that we do need member involvement to a larger extent than the occasional conversation or discussion and debate at this committee. I know we've got the SEAC working groups, which of course have ceased since lockdown. And I suggest that now we're all on a platform that we're reasonably competent with and comfortable with, that perhaps they should continue. Even though they're not public meetings. But I think my point is that each one of these are a massive piece of work, and lots of these are things that we constantly bang our heads against at plans panel meetings, because they don't go far enough and they're not strong enough. So if we got our policies into a place where we wanted them to be in terms of climate change, I think the major thing then would be, we might say they were achievable in our judgment, but how would we get developers to comply? I mean, that is the crunch question for me at every plans panel. Is it policy compliant? And usually the answer is not entirely, and sometimes it's even not at all. So we need to bring the developers with us. And I have made this suggestion before, and we did have one such meeting with developers, and then it's drifted a little bit and lockdowns interfered. But I do think we need to have developers on board with our thinking here. I mean, it might have been an idea to invite a developer today or two. And certainly, David, I think those meetings that you started should resume with developers. We need to be having these conversations with the people that we actually want to do these things, is my point. And I feel there's some urgency. And could you just remind me of the timescale, please?
Thanks, Caroline. I know process is incredibly important. There is a lot of work to be done. And you're right, the pandemic has got in the way for the last 4 or 5 months, although some work has continued. Regarding, so the SEAC working groups, the transport one has progressed, has continued, because that was heavily focused on active travel, which was all part of our response to COVID. But yes, the other ones are starting up again. I make a suggestion. I think the DPP members should be invited to the relevant SEAC working groups. I think that'd be really useful. There's an awful lot we want to do to get it done awfully quickly, and just people watching on I chair both panels, so it's part of my role is to coordinate these matters. So we want to bring DP members into the SEAC working groups, and we can make really rapid progress. There is a lot of process to be worked through. Adam's already suggested bringing back scoping documents, and I think from today's discussions, officers will have a pretty thorough understanding of where elected members are at regarding where we need to see the scope, and it's big, detailed, and involved, isn't it? I think what we introduced a couple of years ago. I mean, the reason why we're having this local plan review is to make sure that we have the strongest possible policies we can have. We introduced EN1 and EN2 a couple of years ago, and at the time they were seen as sort of commented on in the planning sector by they were leading edge. And then it was both heartening and disheartening, if you like, to see how easily developers were able to meet them, because the industry was already starting to change and change quite rapidly. So the successes for those policies need to be very firmly rooted in having a zero carbon focus. And officers have heard that loud and clear from members, along with the green infrastructure and other questions. I think probably then, officer colleagues, if you want to speak to the points about what's the process and the timeline. Adam, you've touched upon it already, but it's probably worth a refresher. I am mindful of time, colleagues. I don't want to go past 1 o'clock, for example. I think with online meetings, everyone's attention starts to wane at probably around about now. So probably I should do something dramatic to make you all wake up. Not that you're asleep, I do apologize. But I think if we could speak to the process and the timeline, because we have covered a lot of content.
Yeah,
and I think that'd be really useful, officer colleagues. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll outline it as I understand it, and obviously, if other officers feel they need to provide clarification, then obviously please step in. Working backwards, I suppose, if we're looking at a spring consultation, we would need approval as the executive board to be able to do that. So if that's timetabled for, let's say, March, we would, if that was the case, then we would need to be bringing probably a preferred scope consultation document to DPP in early 2021. So to be able to do that, we obviously need to be getting into the detail of the topic papers from now until probably the end of the year. So by Christmas, we feel that we've got a draft scope that we can take to consultation. Some of the detailed evidence-based work on that may not be completed. I think we probably have to accept that as a risk. We would probably hope that significant progress had been made, but given the breadth of ideas and issues that have been covered, I think we have to accept that. It's not required to be in place for that Regulation 18 consultation, so that's not an issue to delay. Okay. But evidence is obviously very important as we get towards the sort of the sharper end of the process. Mm-hmm. So that's the headline of it. In terms of the local plan review, which probably needs to be seen as slightly separate from the local plan update, the local plan review is, again, Nicole will step in if I err on this one. My understanding is that David, as the Chief Planning Officer, has the authority delegated to him to approve that review, which can then be put onto our website. And that would simply be a list, as you've seen, showing with an accompanying report showing the approach that we've taken and the policies that should be included in scope of a review. Obviously, the bigger effort is, okay, what do you do with that information? How do you then take that forward? And as you suggest, Councillor Gruen, there's a lot of significant issues in play there that all need careful consideration, and that's what we would hope would be thrown out through the more detailed topic by topic consideration at future meetings. I don't know if anybody wants to comment at that point.
Chair, can I?
Yeah.
Okay, Chair. Thanks. Yeah, I'm just following on from that. I think it's helpful for members to remember that we're not obliged to review everything that potentially needs to be reviewed now, and there is this balance between speed and breadth that we need to strike, and the message is loud and clear that the climate emergency sits at the very top of the policies to be looked at. So what we'll need to do is gather all the points that have been made today and understand that whilst that they may not be up for an update now, they can certainly sit on the local development scheme and form the scope of any future update. Now, part of this is going to be, when we look at the climate emergency policies, how far do they extend to other strategic policies within the plan, and in turn require those to be updated. Now, that's work that we'll start to clarify for members through the topic papers. But the other point that I really wanted to stress is there's still a need for us to heighten the use of existing policies that we already have. Because I know that members have raised some points about existing policies and dissatisfaction with their implementation. But it's really important that through training, through guidance notes, and through other means, we keep ensuring that those policies, especially for the climate emergency, are heightened and do the best they possibly can. And we're achieving that through training materials, for example, that are being driven through the SEAC group.
Okay,
that was all.
No, thanks for that. It's really, really helpful. There is that tension between speed and depth, but I just think, yeah, as you rightly say, Martin, the steer from elected members of this panel is the climate emergency's got to be at the tip of the spear, as it were. David Finney, do you want to come in now?
Thank you, Chair. Just a few points to respond to members' comments, and I found the discussion really helpful, and appreciate the concerns that members are raising. On the green space issues, I think as colleagues have said, we have recently revisited some of our green space policies to make them more effective. But I do take Councillor Campbell's point and comments that have been raised before at panel about the challenge of providing green space, particularly in areas that are already densely developed. It's very challenging, isn't it, without a development proposal in a very densely developed part of the city to create additional green space. And I think some of the issues and circumstances that have been highlighted through the pandemic have been around, the accessibility of green space for vulnerable communities. And I think we need to learn the lessons from the pandemic and try and do something about this strategically. I think through planning, one of the tools we have is about being able to link such communities with networks of green infrastructure. So I think, we do have strategic policies in place for green infrastructure, but it's about the effectiveness of those policies and how we're being able to apply those principles to connect communities up in a more direct way to those green space opportunities. So I think that's about an implementation issue that we can look at in conjunction with our revisited green space policies. I think in terms of permitted development, and colleagues have been mentioning this morning, I personally have concerns about it, because I think some of the permitted development allowances, whilst on one hand are helping to stimulate economic recovery and provide homes, actually, there is a disconnect with sort of the longer term policy objectives that we have, particularly in terms of the quality of place and the quality of development. So there is a concern about that, and I think that's something that we do need to be commenting on, and we are lobbying on this already through various channels. Councillor Anderson made some important points, I think, about sustainability, and as we all know, this is a topic of great debate, isn't it? What does sustainability actually mean? I think in simple terms, and as members are aware, metaphorically, it's about consuming our own smoke, isn't it? It's about the impact that we have and being able to minimize that impact, which is conducive to achieving social, economic and environmental objectives at the same time. But personally, I think it needs to go beyond that, because I think if you can imagine sustainability as a ladder, we need to be laddering up in terms of our application of the achievement of those social, economic and environmental objectives at the same time, rather than passing reference to them. We actually have to make significant changes. And I think at the moment, in government thinking, there is some movement towards improving on sort of the environmental sustainability through commitments to improving net gain, particularly in terms of biodiversity. So that's a positive step, I think, in terms of environmental sustainability, but that needs to be done within the context of environmental capacity in achieving economic recovery and inclusive growth, whilst making sure that there's social justice at the same time. So that these are big topics, but it's holding all of that together, isn't it, through our plan making. In terms of devolution, and Councillor Anderson made one or two points about cross-track boundary working and changes afoot at a sort of a sub-regional level. In terms of devolution, I mean, just to remind members, this is going to be coming forward next year, and one of the jobs of the combined authority will be to prepare a spatial development strategy, and that isn't a rerun of the regional spatial strategy. It's a strategic document, but through the council's comments on the devolution process, we've been at pains to say that this will be the first SDS prepared following the declaration of climate emergencies within local authorities, and therefore that document needs to talk to that agenda and lead on that agenda. So I would hope that some of the comments that colleagues have been making and the scope of our local plan review, that can be used as a basis to help influence the spatial development strategy, because we've got some good ideas about what needs to come forward, and I think we need to be bringing those to that debate. In terms of cross-boundary issues, I mean, we've had long discussions previously at Development Plan Panel on the duty to cooperate, and some of the issues that Councillor Anderson has raised are picked up in that forum. So members just need to be aware that we're not sitting on our hands. Those discussions are still going forward. The other point Councillor Anderson raised about the application of our climate policies at panels, I think we've had this frustration around policy requirements not being specified at outline stage, and because of that it's been difficult to negotiate on individual applications when reserve matters applications come in, and that's a consequence of legal case law rather than something that we should have perhaps picked up sooner. But I would hope that once those particular sites have come through the process, the policies that we are wanting to bring forward that are in place already, as well as the new policies through the local plan review, will enable us to step up in terms of the climate policies. And going to Councillor Gruen's point, I fully agree that we do need to re-engage with the development industry. I mean, there is an appetite within parts of the sector, I think, to take this forward. Others, are getting up to speed, and also there'll be a new cohort of interest in taking forward some of the PD through house builders. So we do need to try and influence all of those providers and sectors within the economy to work together on this agenda. And then finally, I think other colleagues have picked it up, but in terms of the scope of the policies, Councillor Ritchie talked about H5, and Councillor Anderson talked about SB6, SB7. Well, those policies have been subject to recent review, haven't they, through the core strategy selective review. I think some of the issues here are about the implementation and the effectiveness of those policies. So that's something we can turn to as part of the authority monitoring report. So it is something that will be picked up through monitoring prior to a formal review of those policies at the appropriate time. I hope that's a useful catch up on those points, Chair.
It is very much so. Thank you, David. I mean, we have to be really mindful of getting the focus right for this, of the local plan review. It's got to stay focused, not exclusively on climate emergency, but to be seen through a climate emergency lens. That's incredibly important for us as a city council going forward. Councillor, I've got Councillor Ritchie, Councillor Campbell, and Councillor Collins, and then I want to wrap things up.
Sorry, I forgot to lower my hand. I've nothing to add.
Okay. In that case, Councillor Campbell and Councillor Collins, were they new blue hands, so to speak?
No, I forgot to lower mine as well.
Mine was new.
Hey, excellent. Councillor Collins.
Thank you. It's a bit of a technical question, really. To what extent will we be limited in what we can do with the policies with regards to what has been approved in the core strategy? I haven't read the core strategy recently, but I'm sure in there somewhere it says something about infill sites, that we would welcome development of infill sites. I'm just thinking, if we're going to start thinking more about pocket parks and opportunities putting in green space, it may be those infill sites that we want to target for the greenery. Will we be limited in what we can do with a change in policy if it's contradicted in the core strategy? The infill parks was just an example, really.
Officers?
Chair, I think it's a really good question, because this, in looking at a selective local plan update, there will be a need to cross-reference how that affects other policies within the adopted plan. But I think from what we've said today, the focus is very much going to be on updating the strategic policies of the plan as they relate to areas that have significantly changed, coupled with a more in-depth look at climate emergency policies. So it may be that where those policies that we are updating in a strategic manner, they may have an impact on some of the lower policies, non-strategic policies elsewhere in the core strategy. But that's something that we'll deal with and consider through the topic papers and as we progress the review.
Can I just come back, Chair?
Yeah, of course, yeah.
The infill statement within the core strategy, from what I remember, was a policy though. It was just an overarching proposal. So if there isn't a policy underneath it to tweak it, how do we change that?
Chair, so the policy on infill, I mean, I think Councillor Collins is referring to SP1, which is the spatial, the key spatial policy of the core strategy that says that the focus of development will be in the main urban area on infill sites, and then if there are no infill sites, on other sites, and then if there are no other sites, then extensions to the main urban area. I think that's the policy that's being referred to. If there's no reason to change that approach, then that possibly won't be updated. But if there is a reason to heighten or change that approach to better deal with a climate emergency, for example, then that's something that will be within scope of the update.
Okay. I think that's a pretty comprehensive answer, Councillor Collins. So, I mean, we have covered an awful lot of ground. There's quite a lot of sort of, if you like, areas of work there, Adam. I think something we've not particularly touched upon yet, huge, I think Councillor Anderson raised it, but I think just aviation and transport are obviously are really important topics. I mean, starting from, if you like, from the slowest to the fastest modes. I mean, obviously we've got quite a strong pedestrian and cycling focus at the moment, and that needs to obviously continue. We've got a strong public transport focus at the moment. Colleagues are probably aware WICA passed its paper regarding franchising of buses, and that's now a discussion to have with central government. It's probably worth noting that that's been WICA's preferred option for about 4 or 5 years since I was on the old Transport Authority, but it's now an option that government's open to, hopefully. So fingers crossed on that. But obviously, so that needs to be, we need to be mindful of that. But I don't want to be sidetracked from climate emergency. But then we go to aviation. We've got a live planning application with the expansion of Leeds Bradford Airport and its hours of operation. Now that's to be determined. So it's difficult to have a conversation for those of us who are members of the City Plans panel. It's difficult to have much of a conversation on that. But I think Councillor Anderson raised, how do we manage the growth of the airport? Well, I think it's a much bigger question than that. It's about how does Great Britain tackle aviation? There needs to be a national policy focus, and we need to make that clear to government. I know Councillor Mulherin already has done, actually now several occasions, I believe, to ministers, saying that we need a national focus, and it's been it's been a comment raised by our MPs in Parliament too. Currently, we have a positively Bismarckian level of competition between regional airports, and that just won't do when we have to tackle climate emergency. Aviation is a huge contributor to that, and I think we need to see movement from government on that, and I think we need to be stressing that as part of our discussions with central government. So aviation's got to have a role in this policy review, of course. We've talked about green infrastructure, we've talked about housing. I'm just really summing up now, colleagues. If you want to add anything, please feel free. We talked extensively about green infrastructure, process to getting working groups moving. I suggesting getting DP members invited to SEAC working groups. I'm sure colleagues will be okay with that. I think we certainly don't want any delays to how we go forward. I certainly don't think there'll be a problem with the executive board and getting the consultation progressed at all. Is there anything else I've missed? Oh, retrofit. Retrofit's hugely important. As I said before, colleagues, we're a city still wrestling with the consequences of the 19th century, let alone the 20th century in terms of our transport and housing. So, I mean, retrofit's really, really important, and we need to be mindful of that as well. Is there anything else I've missed in that whistle-stop sum up? We've given officers an awful lot to ponder and do. Councillor Mulherin.
Sorry, the only thing I'd say would be local energy generation.
Yes.
Add to that list in terms of tackling the climate emergency.
Yes.
Otherwise, very comprehensive list there, Councillor Walsh.
It is quite a lot of work. So there'll be a lot of midnight oil burn, but that's okay. That's fine. when, I really should know this as chair, forgive me, colleagues. When is our next scheduled meeting, Martin?
I was hoping you'd say Tasha after that
Tasha,
question.
when is our next scheduled meeting?
Just to jump in there, it's Tuesday the 8th of September at 1:30 p.m.
Thank you. Okay, so there's an awful lot that needs doing between now and then. There's an awful lot of scoping reports that need to come back. So what I would suggest is a couple of things. I've already mentioned DP members to be invited to see out working groups, so I'll coordinate that with Tasha. Draft papers can be obviously circulated to DP members as soon as they're available, Adam, for discussion, so we're as forewarned as possible. As a chair, I'm very open to late items, as you know. There's no point delaying things. So I think that's the way forward, and I'll email out to members regarding how we're going to progress all of that officially. Is there anything else? Or have we tentatively covered our agenda? Adam?
Yeah, sorry, it was just in terms of those topic papers, is it worth, there's obviously a lot of topics, so it's just which topic papers should come to which DPPs, I suppose, is the most, in terms of obviously focusing our energies and making sure that we get all our ducks lined in a row. I'm happy to kind of develop a draft program.
Probably a draft program, because if I say all of them, it's most unhelpful. I would suggest, given there's a lot going on in the planning system as a whole, I would suggest to fellow elected members that there's the zero carbon housing. Future development is incredibly important, as is local energy and green infrastructure, and how those three areas and how planning changes might impact them, and how they're going to interface. Something like that for the next meeting. Look, I'm seeing nods from elected members.
Chair,
Good.
it's Martin Elliott. I think that sounds very reasonable. I think an overarching summation of the discussions that we've had here today, as a sort of an overview that then leads us to drop down into individual thematic and topic areas would be my way of looking at it.
I'm comfortable with that. Members?
Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry, Chair, could you just repeat that list you've just said for areas to come back to the next meeting, please?
Oh, heck. No, I'm joking. So broadly speaking, zero carbon housing, both housing and apartment type developments, green infrastructure in all its forms, and local energy production, and how local energy is changing.
Okay.
Which will sit underneath Martin's sort of broad overview, and that'll structure the next stage of policy development. And between now and then, we'll get our heads together regarding what working groups are going to happen and when.
Yeah, would landscape and tree cover go in with that list that you've just read out?
When I say green infrastructure, I mean from
the whole lot.
Yeah, from mandatory hedgerows to green walls to where we're planting our 2.5 million trees.
Fine.
And also back to Councillor Harris' point about how you get community groups involved, because I know several elected members in the city have had real success with engaging local community. Well, they don't need much engaging. They're wanting to do it and getting trees planted already, and it's getting that force multiplier when it terms of getting trees planted as soon as possible. So yeah, when I say green infrastructure, I mean the big picture, all of it. Colleagues happy with that? Councillor Anderson.
Yeah. Are officers confident that they will be able to have some sort of update on the general direction the government are wanting to go in? Whether you may agree with it or not, irrelevant. But the fact is that, will they be able to have the time by the 8th? Because bearing in mind, in August, there's a lot of officers are taking time off and various other things, and this is going to be quite a complicated announcement by the government. Can we get something by this date telling us what the government's agenda is?
Well, that's why we pay David and Martin the big bucks, so I'm sure they'll be able to rise to that challenge.
I think, Chair, that I'm not getting a sense from government that they're going to stop planning for particular themes or particular issues. So I think, Councillor Anderson, I think there's still going to be a need for us to look at what the current planning system should and could offer in terms of local energy generation, and whether we've got the right policies to achieve that, and then should the government decide that it wishes to change the way that's actually implemented, we've at least then got quite a good starting point from which to respond to those changes. But certainly, I think moving on with what we can currently achieve is advised.
Where I'm coming from is the PD rights.
Yep.
You know, if we could get a rough idea from officers what buildings and areas might become areas where this request will come forward, and what's the potential impact going to be on delivery and on the ability of competing planning applications in the system going to be coming in for, and with similar developments in the area and the impact that that might have on too many coming in an area and not enough green infrastructure, for example, being able to be put in place. That's where I'm coming from.
Well, as soon as we know, we'll pull things together and let members know. I think can't really say more than that. I mean, who knows what the government's going to come out with. The Prime Minister recently declared himself the new FDR, and it turned out it was actually the new Herbert Hoover, or rather Herbert Hoover's less successful car salesman brother. So we don't know what's going to come out through the review. I think my concerns, I do share them, all joking aside, about PD. Expanding PD is not the way forward. And as the Chief Planning Officer alluded to earlier on, there is a risk of development to support economic growth at all costs. And that's the wrong way of looking down the telescope, as it were, because I think we all on this panel would agree that we need a jobs revolution in this country. And the way to do that is through something that looks an awful lot like a Green New Deal. And planning can play a huge role in that. And it doesn't need levering out of the way. It needs bringing in and hugging close. And I think that's the way we see it. And I think hopefully the government will see some sense and proceed like that. Without wanting to get into a long esoteric discussion about the failings of the current government, though I know Councillor Anderson wants to, are we about done, folks?
Chair.
Yes.
Chair, could I just ask
Nicole.
that you formally move, second and vote on the recommendations, please?
Ah, democracy, honestly. Yeah, you've seen the recommendations about noting the report and progressing things. Can I have someone to move them? Yep. Councillor McKenna, Councillor Collins. Vote in favour. Hold your hands up. Hey, full suite. Excellent. Well, thank you, colleagues. Is there any other business? No? In that case, thank you very much for your work at this meeting. And I was about to say have a safe journey home, but I'm going to the kitchen. It's about 4 meters that way. So hopefully I'll be able to make that distance without any incident, although maybe a Lego injury from the floor.
Who knows?
Who knows? Right, folks, thank you very much.
Thank you,
Stay safe now.
Thank you, everybody. Take care.
Thank you, Chair.
Bye, Zelda.